Cowboys.
Wow.
Really nice. And back a little bit.
How very far.
But I've been studying some key around. But probably more class literary study.
You have someone join us online.
Or was
Yeah. What's the title is it? Let me check it out. Hello, Professor. Can you hear me? So if you can hear me, can you try to speak?
Yes, I can hear you. I can hear you. Good morning.
Good morning, sir. Oh, let me speak.
Good morning.
Morning. How you doing?
Good. How are you
Good
doing?
to see you again.
Good to see you too. Are you in Oklahoma?
Yeah, I'm in Oklahoma. Yeah, it's
Oh, thank you
really
for
early.
at 3 in the morning. I really appreciate it.
What do we do? I mean, it's an important book, so I really had to make it. Yeah, it's around
Nice.
3 o'clock here.
Okay. Yep. Yep.
It's around three. It's 3:13 now.
Yes, here too.
Yeah, I'm sure it should be like 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock there in Chicago.
3:15, same. Yeah.
Oh, same time.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, we are in the same situation.
Indeed. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Uh, yeah.
Hello.
Good, how you doing? Morning.
Hi, good. Taiwo,
Good to see you.
Sam.
Hi,
Yeah,
good
yeah, good to see you
morning.
too. Hi, Sam. Good to
How are
see
you
you too.
doing?
Very good.
Good. Thanks for being here at this very early hour.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Good morning. How you doing?
Hi, good, thank you. How are you doing?
Good. Thanks for being here.
Oh, no worries.
Hello, Oliver.
Hello, hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
It's up to you. Well, I think it should be like chair. So I'm just gonna actually take off. I'm not the chair. Oh, where's Miriam? Is Miriam? Can you put this? Can you put the? Is does anyone know if Miriam's here in Lagos or is she supposed to be virtual?
Oh no. Sorry. But I'm happy to be chair if she's not around.
the Nigerian Defense Academy, so I guess she would be here. Huh.
Hmm.
It's not available. Sam?
I'm not sure. I haven't heard anything from her, but
Uh,
if she's not here, I can share us. That's no problem.
We'll wait a few more minutes maybe because people are just kind of trickling in from breakfast. It's actually quite quiet outside in the building for some reason, which is strange.
yeah,
Okay, great.
it's also very early in Nigeria too, even though
I
it's
know.
around 9 a.m.
Even there,
Well,
yes.
Nigerians, it's early. Uh,
How is the conference going in Lagos?
Really, really nicely. Really nicely. This is
Oh,
the first
good.
time this is the first time I've been to it since they moved into the Faculty of Arts. So it has quite a different feel than the management sciences.
Oh, yeah, nice. Yeah,
I
I
think
haven't
they're
been for a few years, so
next year's the 10th anniversary.
wow, time
Big
flies.
celebration. So, oh, no, just take a peek at the halls. What's happening for this?
It's good.
Just nobody out there. Oh,
Think we could start at
yeah,
continuous later.
yeah,
It's already 7 minutes into this session.
yeah, absolutely. So I guess we can go ahead and get started then. Whoever would like to kind
Sure,
of chair, right?
sure. Well, I'm not speaking, so I can share if that's not uh, inappropriate. Uh, Welcome everyone. My name is Sam Daly, and I'm the author of the book that is being discussed today, which is called Soldier's Paradise: Militarism in Africa After Empire, which was published last year, 2024, by Duke University Press. Um, it's my very great pleasure to be here, and I'm very grateful to the Lego Studies Association for organizing this panel, and to our five really fantastic respondents. So I think if it would be all right with you all, we'll just go in the order that is listed in the program. I won't introduce you at any great length, but if you'd like to say who you are and where you're coming from, that would be great. So I don't know how long you want to speak. I'd say uh, 10 to 15 minutes, certainly no more than that each, and then we'll have some time for an open discussion with those who are in the room. Does that sound okay? All right, great. So first up, we have Taiwo Bello from Oklahoma State University. Good morning and take it away.
oh yeah. Good morning to everyone. All the faces here on the screen are familiar to me, so I don't think I have to introduce myself to any of them. But for the benefit of those who are in the room there, uh, well, my name is Taiwo Bello. I'm an assistant professor of African history at Oklahoma State University. And I work in areas such as violence, conflict, gender, uh, crime and law, amongst other areas of interest. In short, my areas of interest are wide ranging. Um, okay, so first, I would like to thank the organizers of this panel, for giving me, the opportunity to share my view on the latest, I would say the latest book in our field, uh, Soldier's Paradise. And also, I would love to thank Sam for giving us this gift. You know, it's an important gift, and it is one that I think would shape the field. If it hasn't now, yeah, within the next, few weeks, it will, we'll start to hear a lot about it. I really learned a lot about, I mean, from the book, especially within the field of, militarism. And as you know, this is a book that is at the core of what I do as well, right? So it's just like the first one on the Nigerian Civil War. It's a go-to for me. It's a book that I always run to. I always refer to it. Short, even yesterday, I still referenced it for my latest work. So it's a very important book, which I think is not as some people would want to would want to have us believe. It's not just focusing on Nigeria. I like the fact that it touches on aspects of militarism in different places too. In Ghana, in Uganda, like right, which takes us away from what we are already familiar with as Nigerian scholars, right? So that's a very key contribution of the book. It is broader than the way one would want to think. So thank you very much for that. Uh, and I also like the fact that the book touches on different aspects that shaped the the lives of people in Nigeria as well as Nigerian society, especially from the 70s till 90s, right? You talked about why war against indiscipline. I can remember very well growing up in Nigeria, born in the 80s and growing up in the 80s and 90s. And like my parents would always talk about, why war against indiscipline and the likes. And also, a very key figure whom you talked about, Fela Nicola Kuti. These were childhood fantasies for many of us who grew up in Nigeria and the likes. Yeah. So as much as the story you've told is a familiar story, this is a very groundbreaking work which I think everyone should have on their share. Um, so that I would now like to go to the next phase uh, by highlighting the four key contributions or takeaways from the book, I think, just so as to make their contributions as well. So I'll talk about I'll mention these four key contributions. Interventions, I think the book uh, is making or has made or would make going forward, depending on how far the readers have gone into it. Then after that, I will just ask a few questions. I've got a few questions to raise about, the book as well. Then I will conclude from there. So what does the book do for me? Very important piece. I've got it. I think number one, the book highlights the centrality of the ideology, philosophy of militarism, to other forms of isms, right? Or ideologies, or such as communism and capitalism, right? Calling our attention to the role that militarism, uh, you know, had played and continues to play in shaping our world and worldview. Oftentimes we don't, the emphasis, we often emphasize on communism when we think about ideologies and philosophies, right? Ideas, principles, amongst other things, right? We emphasize capitalism, communism whenever anything happens and likes. But we forget that militarism is at the heart of this whole thing, right? Capitalism would not be what it is today if not, for the idea of militarism, right? America is militaristic. It's uh, Russia, China, amongst other key countries, right? So it centers, militarism within the other forms or kinds of isms, right? Uh, Capitalism, communism. So that's just to state that. And then secondly, the book projects the agency of African soldiers, right? Oftentimes when anything happens in Africa, we often relate it to, oh, America had an involvement in it. This would not have happened if America did not contribute to it, right? American officials played a role in it. I can remember when Abacha died, right? One of the one of the news that were flying around then was that, oh, America, played a role in his death and stuff, right? They were watching him, taking his bath and stuff. Uh, but you you actually demonstrated clearly that, look, these guys, these African soldiers, especially Nigerian soldiers, were very independent, right? They knew what they were doing. They knew what they wanted to achieve, even though, execution was a key problem for them. They were not dependent on foreign governments to act and, take action, right? So that aspect of African agency is another thing that actually came out clearly to me. And if we look through all the chapters, including the chapter on Fela, the Lacomi, versus the states and the likes, we see even the area where you talked about, how colonialism shaped militarism, right? We see everything clearly there. It came out clearly, yeah. And that's one of the key things I like, the African agency that you actually demonstrate. And also the third one, unlike existing scholarships, which portray African military leaders as evil, clueless. Yeah, I remember again growing up, people said a lot of things about Babangida, about Abacha, especially the likes, right? But today we we see that even though Abacha stole the money of which you alluded to, right? Stole money, was corrupt and the likes. There's no difference between the actions of the military guys and those who are ruling today, right? Uh, uh, the Bola Tinubu and Buhari, who had ruled before and came back again and ruled, and Jonathan and the likes. We can see almost similarity and stuff. And I like the fact that you called us to caution, or you call us to caution, you know, by stating that, look, this is not, yeah, these guys can be evil or whatever, right? But if we look at militarism very closely, it also has something good to offer, right? It depends on who is handling it or what one does with it, right? So militarism is not entirely an evil thing, right? Just depends, just like capitalism. I still bring us, or communism. Some people would say there's nothing good to it, right? Some people say there's something good to it, right? You are telling us that this is not an entirely evil ideology, right? It just depends on who is doing what, who is in charge of it, right? It can do good and it can do bad. It goes both ways, right? So that's another key contribution I see from here. And lastly, in terms of contributions, the book takes us through the irony of uh, military rule or military regimes in Africa generally, not only in Nigeria. Uh, the ideology of militarism was introduced, just to display, so for African military, thank you very much, for African military leaders, right? Or African countries to escape or to free themselves from the oppressive, kind of elements that uh, characterized colonial rule, right? They wanted to free themselves from colonial rule, from the way colonial governments and ruled their countries and likes. But at the same time, in trying to do that, they were executing the same thing that they were trying to run away from. So that's the hierarchy, right? You say these people they are oppressive, they've done bad to our people and the likes, right? We want to be different from them. We want to be modern. In trying to do that, they they became monsters themselves, right? So that's the irony that I see in that, and you demonstrated that very well, especially with the court case of Fela, the likes. Yeah, we saw that very clearly. The Lacomi amongst others. So those are the key four contributions that I can. I mean, it's got a lot of other key contributions, so that I'll allow my colleagues to to touch on them as well. I'll leave that. So, what am I not sure about? Right, and this is not to say anything about it, but I'm wondering if if we take away, the guns and other forms of weapons from these guys, right? The military from the military guys, do we see, you know, um, do we see them, exhibit the same, attitude of the civilian governments, right? If we go back to the 50s, to the 40s and 50s and the likes, right? Or in other words, were the actions of the military guys shaped in the first place by the actions of the so-called civilian political leaders? Now I'm thinking about the revelation made in his book, Why We Struck by Ademoyega, right? And we all know what propelled the first military coup, that led to this whole idea of militarism, right? You know those guys, right? So that's one thing. Do we see their actions as a reflection of the actions of the military, sorry, the civilian regimes, before then, even until date? And secondly, what explains the flourishing of militarism, right, or military coup or military takeovers in the former British colonies, as opposed to the French, the Portuguese, the Italian, the Spanish, amongst others. And why are we seeing a flip today? Right. What used to be was the British Commonwealth, the British Empire, likes, right? West Africa. Why are we seeing a flip from that to the French side now? Now we have Guinea, we have Burkina Faso, we have Mali, we have Niger, amongst other things. Why are we having that today? And I think lastly on page 113, yeah, I'm going to round up. I'm rounding up now, Sam. On page 113, you alluded to the fact that the military guys had some respect for judges, that they were okay. I'll read. You said uh, soldiers were wary of going after judges directly, right? Their ideology of law and order gave them, begrudging respect for the courts, and jailing judges would be a bridge too far for most of them. This is on page 133. But I'm wondering, in the case of Nigeria, did these guys really have any form of respect for the courts or the judges? I can remember very well. Now, as you know, in my own current project, these guys suspended the court, right? They didn't want to have anything to do with the Supreme Court, with the high courts and the likes. And that was why they decided to introduce their own tribunal. And whatever the tribunal said was final. And this was actually one of the things that led to the execution of Kesa Orua, whom we talk about today, right? The issue is still. And I can remember very well that these guys also arrested, detained, and jailed some of the key legal luminaries, right? The Ganifawa Imi, Femi Falana, amongst other Agbakoba likes, right? So to me, it doesn't, I mean, all these, when we bring them together, do not indicate that the military guys would have any respect. They could do anything, they were free to do anything. And it goes back to the African agency that you highlighted clearly in the book. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much, Sam, for the opportunity to read this book and speak about it.
Great. Thank you so much, Taiwo. Next up, we have Oliver Coates of the University of Cambridge. I'll give you a sign at 10 minutes and then another one when we should maybe start wrapping up. Great. Thanks a lot. Oliver.
Thank you very much. So yeah, as Sam mentioned, I'm Oliver Coates. I'm Director of Studies in History and Politics at St Edmund's College, Cambridge. And I'd like to talk a little bit today about the kind of general themes involving the book, and then perhaps four more specific areas that I kind of discern as relating to the book itself. I think that, to start with, it's worth saying that I think Sam's book offers a sort of heuristic way of looking at how to write the history of post-colonial periods, because as Sam mentions in the book, this is a period when archives remain closed. Definitely in the case of sort of Nigerian archives, but also in the case of metropolitan archives, or when they're not closed, they're often kind of limited to diplomatic sources in particular. So it's a period where common source bases are not as useful to historians as they are in earlier periods. And with that approach, I think Sam has created a study which joins together several different areas of history. And so these can include the history of law, which is kind of motivating force, I think it's fair to say, behind the book. But in its treatment of the history of law, it includes some arguments that have much wider implications for social history of Nigeria. So particularly the argument that the existence of legal structures in post-colonial Nigeria did not in itself defend or subvert the state, including the military state, but instead was a kind of resource that different actors could appropriate and use. So there was no inherent meaning in itself to the rule of law as a construct. And this is an insight that has been seen in the historiography of colonial law in West Africa, but I think it's kind of new to apply it in this context, particularly in relation to authoritarianism and military rule. Other areas of the book really speak to kind of intellectual and cultural history, including the kind of references that occur throughout the book to the performance of soldiering almost, so the kind of the metaphorical meanings of uniforms, and then perhaps also in terms of intellectual history, the idea that military rule could be an ordering factor, could be a factor that controlled and removed problems from society that civilian rule was incompetent of removing. So this perception of the ability of the military to order, we should say here when we talk about the military that we're really talking about the army rather than other kind of branches of the military, which I've never seen any material relating to how far those do operate in this function, but it might be interesting to think of. I suspect this might be slightly more accessible, say in late 1950s Ghana, for example, where there's a body of work about the Navy rather than it might be in 70s Nigeria, but that's just a hunch. So the risk of kind of horrifying Sam slightly, I'm going to kind of suggest in the rest of the presentation how his book can relate back to military history, which I think is a field that obviously kind of haunts behind the book. and Sam made some good kind of points about the way in which military history of the post-colonial period is written. Above all, he kind of points out the limit of ethnicity-focused military history, which defines the kind of overarching accounts of post-colonial military history, like the kind of work of Minnes or Luckham, which are now old works, but they continue to have this outsized influence as a literature about why specific ethnic groups competed for resources within the colonial military. And Sam's work moves beyond and outside of that. So more specifically, I think there are 4 areas of military history that I'll briefly relate to kind of Sam's book, hopefully where I think they touch. So one of them is perhaps seemingly marginal at first, which is the historiography of ceremony which exists in the history of the colonial military. It's less written about in the context of post-colonial military. And in general, it's a kind of quite neglected field, and it includes arcane things like insignia, kind of rituals and ceremonies for kind of true welfare and entertainment, but also decisions about sartorial culture. So in the colonial period, these could be key sites for racial discrimination, where discriminatory uniforms, for example, were issued to African troops, like wearing shorts and certain kinds of footwear in contexts where European soldiers were not required to wear them. So clothing could have kind of direct racial and also social implications. And it strikes me behind this account of the perception of the orderly soldier in the post-colonial period, there is kind of something connecting to the historiography of military ceremony in Nigeria itself, and sartorial culture, the kind of wider social meanings of uniform, and the perception in wider society of uniform. So this segues on to like the secondary, which is civilian relations, sometimes the military-civilian relations. I think in this context, in the post-colonial period, my impression is that outside of a literature on Biafra, so for example, bombing of civilians in Biafra, and the rule of law in Biafra, which Sam has written about before, or kind of human rights abuses in the same conflict, there's relatively little literature in the kind of 70s, 80s period on military-civilian relations as such, although there is significant literature from political science on military dictatorship and the civilian impact of military dictatorship or military rule. So I think that in the field of military-civilian relations proper, as it was in the specific way in which militaries relate to civilian populations, Sam's book again speaks to this theme, because ultimately it's concerned with what really could be called war in society. So the social perception of the military, the social perception of warfare. And this segues into the third area, which will probably be the most kind of horrifying to hear, which is operational history. So you could say, like, how is this book possibly related to operational history? But one of the arguments that Sam, I think, is making is that the armies were quite occupied in this period doing other things other than fighting war, and maybe they did not in fact see themselves as being used most suitably to fight war. In fact, they were kind of fighting a peace of a kind by saying they were more competent to rule than civilian governments. So in a sense, Sam is offering what we might call kind of anti-operational history, or a history of military efficiency that is based on civilian criteria rather than military criteria. Yeah, like operational history, which is the history of kind of actual activities of war, actual activities of conflict, this still hinges on a perception of military efficiency. There's no point having a call for the military to run civilian affairs if one believes the military is fundamentally inefficient. So you could see this as nonetheless relating to operational capacity or operational competency, even if it is misplaced, at least by Western historiographical standards, by focusing on civilian rule rather than military warfare. The final area that I think probably the book speaks to, and this is more niche, is the kind of perception of British colonial officials in the kind of colonial and early post-colonial period. And Sam makes an interesting point in the introduction to the book, which is that the British civilians in the colonial period were perceived as having the ineptitude, if you like, that later Nigerian civilian rulers were also perceived to have, and that against that, British officers, and there's a kind of section about the kind of officer training school at Mons, for example, in the institutional culture of officer training, that these perceptions of British officers were more favourable than the perception of British colonial officials, which I think is an interesting argument. I'm not sure how far it becomes geographically or socially bounded, so who particularly might be prone to think this, but it suggests basically that there are parallel kind of personas of colonial authority in Nigeria, and that some of these are respected or feared more than others, and that is related to perception of military rule or military capacity. This would potentially fit with a kind of literature about officer structures in the Nigerian army, the ability of command structures to function in the Nigerian army, and how far perceptions of race or perception of culture conditioned the likelihood of individuals to accept authority within military command structures. So I think it's slightly more niche, but I think this is the kind of final of the kind of 4 areas where I see Sam's book directly relating to military historiography, which is to say in some, but I think we can read Sam's book against the letter perhaps as being a work of military history in a particularly kind of new and perhaps kind of sideways manner that kind of raises questions about overarching habits within military historiography of Nigeria, particularly the reliance or obsession with ethnicity, and particularly a kind of function, a focus on key conflicts like Biafra at the expense of periods of peacetime kind of rule. So I'll close by saying that one thing that I think the book invites us to think about, but I'm not sure how far it can ever be empirically kind of demonstrated, is the way in which, in fact, not only are there colonial continuities informing Sam's argument, but in fact, there are also pre-colonial continuities. So the perception that the military has an ordering role, I think it's probably unlikely or insupportable factually to kind of show a direct transfer for all of Nigeria between any pre-colonial development and the phenomena Sam is talking about. But I think there are possible connections, one of which is the perception in, say, the military forces of the Sokoto Caliphate, that the military were defending a rule of order, in this case of Dar al-Islam, against a rule of unbelief or of chaos, whether that be unbelief in kind of African Muslim societies or unbelief in terms of British invasion. Finally, the other area of pre-colonial history that I think that this potentially speaks to is the way in which military service was informalized explicitly within many pre-colonial armies. So, for example, in the Yoruba conflicts in the 19th century, the way in which military service was not a professional soldiering role undertaken by standing military, but was part of a spectrum of obligations that bound individuals to rulers and chiefs, including giving agricultural produce, offering labor or hunting rights, as well as military service. So the way in which potentially the book ultimately chips away, despite this image of the strong military, whether it's actually chipping away at how far there's a coherence to the Western idea of a standing military. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Oliver. Moving right along, our next panelist is Eric Covey of Grand Valley State University, who I believe is there in the room.
I am, yeah. So thank you. I had picked up a copy of this book last year, but hadn't had a chance or time to read it yet. So I was excited to be part of this panel, but because I had overcommitted to too many things, I didn't manage it till I got to Lagos this week. And I think that actually was a real benefit in reading it here. And I'll say a little more about that later. But first, let me hit on what I think are three things that I found really interesting in the book, some of which we're already kind of discussing here. And the first of those, I think, is against this idea that ethnicity is the Rosetta Stone of Nigerian history. Your book, Sam, really advances this idea of intra-class politics. So obviously in chapter 1, you're detailing the fact that, the ideology of militarism and these soldiers truly believed that they were going to deliver more authentic independence than these civilian elites, right, who they were replacing. And then again in chapter 2, where you talk about, you bring up Buhari's war against indiscipline, but I think even more interesting is this war on filth, right, where you illustrate the kind of interclass tensions of military rule. Most of these soldiers, as you point out, were also lower class, right, like the urban poor, but they were rural. So, I think your conclusion that in Kano and other urban centers, military rule was experienced as a quote, long, brutal occupation. I think that's a really interesting insight. And that also, chapter 2 is, I think, the chapter in this book where Lagos really takes center stage. And then, too, in terms of those intra-class politics, I think chapter 5, where you talk about Fela Kuti, Calcutta Republic, I think that will be one of the most widely read and discussed chapters, this kind of fresh appraisal of that military tribunal at the National Theater in Lagos in March 1977 under Obasanjo, who I'll bring up again in a minute, too. He's been in the news this year in a kind of connected way. But I think here what you kind of, when you read these transcripts from that tribunal and other evidence, I really appreciate again that kind of insight that what this evidence actually reveals is, quote, the rage of a humiliated underclass, right? Fela's on the balcony and he's kind of talking down, to these soldiers. And it's clear that he came from a class that would have been among the elites had this military coup, military rule not taken place. So the kind of class politics, I think, is one of the most interesting things about the book. Another thing that I really personally enjoyed was chapter 3, which is about. I know Taiwo says that this is a book about Africa. That's the subtitle, but I think in a lot of ways this feels like a book about Nigeria. Chapter 3, though, is the book that really details best this continental-wide focus of the book, this kind of traffic and movement of judges between current and former British colonies across the continent and elsewhere. And the focus here, right, is on Sir Egbert Udo Udoma, Chief Justice of the Ugandan Supreme Court. He was hired essentially as a kind of mercenary justice. And then he comes back and works on the Nigerian Supreme Court under Ademola. And he's an unlikely figure, as you point out, to have been among the judges who would support militarism because his mom in 1929 is shot by soldiers in the Aba women's uprising. Nevertheless, you conclude that the legal decisions he and other justices handed down continue to truly, right, haunt African politics. So again, as someone with an interest in the field of historical biography, that was one of my favorite chapters in the book to read. And like Taiwo, of course, I learned a lot from this entire book. And finally, and kind of connected to what Oliver is saying here, I also read this as an intellectual history. You position it as a legal and kind of psychological history, but I think very much because of the sources you're using and the way you're using them, this feels like an intellectual history. And that idea of the military historians are always saying military history, like you said, Oliver, is always operational history. I had kind of noted that, and I wondered if we might then also not think of governing as a kind of form of military operation under militarism, right? So the kind of operation that's taking place is not a battle or, whatever things militaries are doing, but actually governing as a form of operation. I also wanted to say just a few things about the way in which the kind of book is written. I think your voice is always front and center. You're very kind of honest in the beginning about how the things that were happening in your life shaped how you went about kind of putting all this material, scattershot material together. And, that also shaped then how I read the book. So, because my first impressions of Nigeria were formed in Abuja rather than Lagos or elsewhere, this kind of militarism's ambience, which really shapes how Abuja is constructed, looms large in my memory of the country. I took my first Nigerian meal of fish at Mami Market in Mogadishu barracks. I was almost arrested by a dingy kind of police officer, a detective in Eagle Square in Abuja, right? This space that's overwhelming expanse of asphalt built for the giants of Nigeria's military government. And at the time, to save myself from this dingy policeman, I begged for assistance from crisply dressed soldiers, right? Uh, and then also finally, as this book is required reading, of course, for anyone interested in Nigerian history, military history. But I also found myself reading it from my own position as an American living under an increasingly authoritarian government, seemingly no longer bound by the decisions of the courts, many of which are already dominated by its own appointees. So when you're talking about this kind of tension between soldiers and these judges who they envisioned as their deputies, I couldn't help but think of the fascist right's increasing attacks on Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who was a Trump appointee, but who has failed to kind of fall in line with the MAGA movement. So I think the book illuminates issues in African history, but I think is also a useful heuristic for thinking uh, about things that are happening in the kind of contemporary United States. So thank you for the opportunity.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Eric. Okay, our next speaker is Olushola Ogunwubi of Queen's University, who I hope is in the room. Is that right? If not, I guess we will move on to our next speaker, Akali Omeni of Boston University.
Hi, thank you very much, Sam, for this opportunity. And thank you to all the speakers so far. Um, this was a very interesting book to read. Um, I will go through just brief notes that I took on each of the chapters, but I just before then wanted to say that what really struck me in approaching this walk, Sam, is the sense that you really understand Nigeria. Like you really, this wasn't an outside in superficial historical archive based discussion of what had happened. I did get the sense that it wasn't just the kind of language you use, but the kind of social detail you went into. I got the sense that you really understood the country, and you write so well that most times when I read this book, I kind of pictured myself in those scenarios, like, being a bystander at Calcutta Republic and kind of seeing Fumi Ransom Kuti whether being thrown down the stairs or being gently taken down or being thrown out the window, depending on who you speak to in the book. It was just so well written, and I think that's really important because the folks who are going to read this book, they just don't want to be stuck with operational histories and technical jargon. They really want to get a sense that these histories were done justice, and I think you've done that quite well in this walk. So well done, Sam. Uh, in terms of the chapter structure, I think it flowed really well. I think you made a very clever decision around what aspects to focus on as you develop your narrative. So let me give you a couple of examples. The rule in Nigeria is underpinned by four main planks: the military, the police, the judiciary, and the civil service. And this book is unapologetically focused on the military and the judiciary. Um, and people might ask, well, why didn't the police have a bigger role, or why didn't you speak more about civil service? But it's really a book about the military and how they essentially used the judiciary to prop their rule in many respects, right? Because the 30 something plus years of military rule in Nigeria were largely underpinned by martial law. And so the judiciary was a very important aspect of that role. And so kind of focusing on both these actors worked really, really well, I think. Um, Chapter structure, the master's tools. Uh, just kind of looking at that title alone, what really came to mind, and I think you touched on that quite early on in the work, where you said that colonialism was not just about violence and kind of, rule by the kind of threat of force. And I think this is really important because, and I'm just as guilty of that, right? When I kind of write on Nigerian military history, or on the Nigerian colonial history, a lot of my writing has been on the role of the military and the police in those colonial contexts. But actually, colonial rule was so much more than that. If we want to kind of talk about terra nullius and the model agreements, right? This idea that there were lots of ways to get folks to do things, and you touch upon that in your book, which weren't necessarily in their favor, but which you made them do nevertheless. And force didn't always have to be involved. And to some degree, we kind of see that when the military came to power, right? A lot of the things that people were being asked to do, for instance, in war against indiscipline, probably weren't things that they wanted to do, but they did them anyway because they were kind of made to buy into this idea of the collective good, etc. Um, and so the master's tools, I guess what I'm trying to say is the master's tools were handed down to those that came afterwards. Um, uh, Except not all the tools were handed down or were adopted, and that's something you also highlight. I wrote about this as a fresh PhD. Uh, um, this idea of institutional isomorphism, the idea that an institution kind of takes tools from its predecessor if those tools favor it and
Oh,
discard tools that don't favor it. I'll give an example. In the case of the Nigerian military, the Sandhurst formula of political neutrality. Well, that wasn't convenient, right? So that was the first to go. Um, but everything else, and the trappings of British military rule and all that was handed down, all those were kind of embraced very enthusiastically. And so. I found that chapter very, very instructive and kind of a good way to lead into the rest of the book. The second chapter, The Soldier's Creed, um, this chapter was very impressive for me because I said to myself, right, he's kind of gotten out the inheritance of colonialism out the way, and so surely there'll be lots of talk about the Civil War and the role play. But interestingly, you kind of, and this is what I said about making very clever decisions in terms of where you took a narrative. You kind of tiptoed around the Civil War, and you, instead of presenting the operational history that I thought you would, you kind of talked more about militarism as a creed because this wasn't just about soldiers. And when I use the word soldiers, I use it in the very same context that you do, i.e., anyone who wears a military uniform, because otherwise it will mean something very particular. But these soldiers, they essentially saw themselves as Praetorians, right? They really felt that they could do a better job than the civilians. This wasn't something, it wasn't just because they had guns. They truly felt that they were better administrators, they were better economists, they were better legalists, all of the above. Well, maybe not better legalists, which is why they needed the judiciary so much. But they certainly felt that rule was something that they could do. And they had this kind of great disdain for the way their predecessor had run things. And this is where we see kind of Praetorianism really informing the several decades of the interregnum. Moving on to the portable coup, the jurisprudence of military revolution. That was for me I learned so much from that chapter because this is where you kind of spend more time talking about the legal side of things. Right. The Justice Udoma situation was especially very instructive. I had no idea that this kind of import-export of legal expertise was so widespread across the late early post-colonial era, I should say. Um, Something that I asked myself though in thinking about Justice Udoma was he kind of was he left out the fold, so to speak? Uh, uh, simply because Ademola recommended Teslim Elias, or did his ethnicity have anything to do with it? Right, because this is not something. Yes, I know you've said in the book, and to a large extent, I agree with you that the military kind of transcends the kind of ethnic quagmire that kind of stuck the previous governments. But ethnicity did play a role, not just in the military's organization and who got sent where. Um, but also, I would hazard to some degree, at least, who they appointed at that kind of federal level. And so I'm just wondering, did his ethnicity play a role there? Just some food for thought. Um, Oracles and autocrats, the customary law theme is really fascinating because I think that that's something local customs are they I think they hold explanatory power if we're trying to understand the different parts of Nigeria. Something that I write about in my forthcoming book. This is not about me, but I just want to quickly highlight this idea that in the east of the country, for instance, bloodshed was something that was a taboo, right? And so the kind of military cultures that emerged in eastern Nigeria were very different to the military cultures that emerged from elsewhere. Now, this also meant that the warfare didn't develop in eastern Nigeria, the southeast of Nigeria, the way it developed across the rest of the country. But this was construed to mean that the Easterners were incapable of waging warfare, right? But if you look at their local customs, you will find that they had different oracles that basically saw bloodshed as a taboo, right? And so I guess my point is, taking a deeper dive into local customs is actually quite important if you're trying to understand why people act the way they do. Um, Kind of going from the southeast to the part of the country. On page 134, you mentioned something about the local emirs welcoming the return of customary law, but also mentioned that they wanted it to be separate from Sharia. I really liked that aspect of your narrative because that's also something that I've also been working on. This idea that in the colonial era, there wasn't really, well, there was an ambiguous distinction between Sharia and native law and custom, right? Sometimes Lugard made a clear distinction between them. Sometimes he lumped them together. And confusingly, he would do one after the other. So he will make that distinction and then lump them together, and then make that distinction and then lump them together. So I guess you can see how this was quite confusing for the local folks. And you were exactly right in saying that, look, they've always wanted this distinction uh, uh, going forward. Don't want to take too much more time. I just want to quickly point to the Fela Kuti case as being it almost I feel like this chapter of your book could be made into like a small play or a small movie, something. It was so well written. I mean, and the witness evidence you presented, I would say that I don't think anyone else has gone this deep in kind of finding out all the details of that case. Um, I'm not just saying this, flippantly, but I think this is something that could be adapted for the screen. Like, it was well done, especially because that is such an important part of Nigeria's social history. I don't think there's any Nigerian who grew up in the 70s, 80s who hadn't heard about that whole fiasco. And obviously, Fela, being who he is, launched a bunch of songs about that whole experience. Um, Okay, gift of martial law, military tribunals for civilians. Look, martial law, like Ty was said, like whatever the appeal, whatever the tribunals said held, right? And I think that these tribunals were the very, I think you could call them the crystallization of martial law because this was a forum where the military really could flex its muscles, right? Where the only people who had a say in the outcomes, regardless of the substance of the case, as you should time and again, where the military folks. In fact, sometimes, from what you've said in the book, it almost seemed like these trials were a foregone conclusion. So why go through all the trouble then? You do a good job in explaining why. Because these facades are also important for the for legitimacy or for the perception of legitimacy. Um, Sam, this was an excellent book. I really, I mean, I got the soft copy months ago when Saeed sent them to us. And I read the first page, and I said, you know what? I think I'm going to be okay with this book. And so I kept it aside, and I said, I know I can read this book in a single sitting in a day, right? And that's pretty much what happened because I read this over the last couple of days, maybe. And the only reason I could take that risk was because I read the first page and it was so easy to get into that I knew that I wouldn't have any trouble. This is a fantastic, fantastic book. Well done.
Oh, thank you so much. Okay, just to make sure we don't have our fifth speaker is not present, right? Okay. So if it's all right, I'll just take a few minutes to respond to these responses, and then we can open up for questions from the room. Um, Thank you so much, all of you, for your responses to this book. You know, you write something like this, and then you put it out in the world, and you have no idea where it goes or who, if anyone, will read it. And it's nice to know that I have, at least four extremely good readers. I'm very grateful for your time and your attention. Um, I think there's good reason to be suspicious of how I treat these men, as various people have raised in various ways. I cut them a lot of slack, and I spend a lot of time mucking around in legal archives in a way that arguably distracts from some of the other things that they were doing. Fundamentally, Nigeria's military regimes ruled by force. And as I read back through the book myself, that actually is a bit soft pedaled. I think that fact is kind of underplayed. Um, I talk about some soldiers and not others. I'm selective about the particular court cases that I describe. I cop to all of that. But by way of a defense or an answer to that, I would say, every historian, myself included, has an object of interpretation and an object of critique. And for me, those two things are not the same. So my object of interpretation or my object of study would be these particular military regimes, how they worked, how the men who led them thought, maybe a little bit about what they did in an operational sense. But my sights are actually set on something larger and something outside of Nigeria, if I'm being completely honest. Um, I'm trying to understand why people feel a fetishistic attachment to rules. And the particular form that has taken for me is military administration, but I think it could have been something else. You know, Eric brings up the connection to the United States in the present, which is something that is on my mind all the time these days. I chose Nigeria as the place to stage this argument about why people are attached to constraint and why uh, political limitations or constraints might actually be appealing to some people. But I could have said it in my own country, in the United States. And as dictatorship, becomes an important part of American politics, all of a sudden, uh, it is clear to me that I could have said it here too. So I guess I'm always trying to understand something more psychological than strictly historical, and this book is no exception. Taiwo asked the important question about, take away the guns and what is left? Who are these people? Um, I think they are a particular kind of people. And there's something particular about military training and the military experience, perhaps also the choice to become a soldier in the first place, that explains something about the particular political ideas that these people have. I think that it's not just a matter of the guns. The guns are kind of a distraction. And fundamentally, what is more important about making a military regime work or not work or how it works is really the thoughts that the people underneath the uniforms have. And I've tried to capture that. But, to Oliver's point, that has meant leaving aside certain important questions or things that are important to people who are more conventional military historians. I should say I got no beef whatsoever with operational history. And actually, I'm very sympathetic to a lot of um, the kind of explanatory mechanisms that you find in operational history that you don't find elsewhere. Operational history thrives in the spaces of tiny contingencies. Do you go above the hill or do you go around it? That decision, that small decision, can shape huge, long reaching historical forces or trajectories. I think that's actually very powerful and very important. Um, I liked I think it was Eric's suggestion that maybe government is part of the operation and operational history for a military regime. I think that's a good way of kind of squaring these things. What does the political history of a military regime look like if you were to take an operational approach with all of its attention to detail and contingency and apply it to how a military runs the state, runs a government? I didn't put it in that way in the book, but hearing you all talk, it makes me think maybe I should have, because that's actually a really interesting insight. And some of the aspects of military history around insignia and uniforms and that kind of thing that Oliver talks about, I am extremely interested in, and actually more and more, after having finished this book. Right now, I'm working on a project about military uniforms that isn't just about Nigeria, it's about everywhere. But it's about the uniform as a fetishized object, as this almost magical thing that transforms the person who puts it on into something different. Um, I think that kind of process is best understood using the tools of conventional military history. So I'm picking up those tools more and more myself. But I admit that this book is not really a military history. It is, as Oliver says, more a war and society book. But I guess I'd say that the boundary between those things is a little bit blurry, and I hesitate to put myself firmly on one side or the other. Um, of the kind of military history versus war and society division. Um, Eric draws our attention to the fact that we make choices, and that I make choices, and that a lot of those choices are determined by the circumstances of our own lives. I think this is certainly not the main point of this book, but it is an important one, and it was one that I thought about a lot as I was writing it. The choices that I made were particular. I chose to emphasize class instead of ethnicity, which maybe reflects my own political disposition more than anything else, but I do think is also true. I loved the term of the ethnicity is not a Rosetta Stone for Nigerian politics. That's an excellent way of thinking about it. I don't mean to suggest that class is, or that some of the other things that I've substituted are the key that unlocks everything where ethnicity has failed. But nonetheless, I did make that choice. Um, and I don't think I regret that, but it is a choice. And I think it's important to own up to that as historians. Frederick Jameson, the Marxist political thinker, has this metaphor that I love about what history is. He says history is like a dimly lighted basement that is full of gears and pipes and mysterious valves that go to different places. And historians are like the technicians who operate in this dark basement and are figuring out which valves and pipes go where, what they measure, but nobody actually knows what is outside of the basement. Nobody knows what is really being measured or how all of these things work together. They're just choosing which parts of this vast, complicated apparatus they themselves are tinkering with. And I think that's it's important to own up to the fact that we all do that in one form or another. And I have chosen here to tinker with the valves and pipes of military ideology, but that doesn't mean that there are other valves and pipes out there that are maybe more important. I just can't tell. Uh, that was a garbled metaphor, but I hope you get my drift. Akali, I'm so glad that it seems like I understood something about Nigeria. I don't think I did though. And I'll be honest, this is a place that I'm a foreigner and always have been. Um, Right now, as I mentioned, I'm actually working on the United States, on my own country, the place where I live and supposedly know intuitively. And it's really interesting to move from studying a place that I don't know intuitively, Nigeria, to one that I ostensibly do. And the lesson of this for me is that intuition means nothing. Actually, trying to understand a place through what you know from experience leads you down all kinds of blind alleyways. And for me in the United States, this means coming to understand that my perception of my country and my country's history is completely different from how just about everybody else perceives it. Any insight that I have about Nigeria has been eked out through study, and uh, I've never really felt that I understood this place. But now that I'm working on a place that I think I know better, I'm learning that maybe you just never fully see the picture, whether you're from the place or not. To turn to your more substantial points, which I think are excellent. Um, how did the military convince people to do things? That is a big question for me in this book. And I think the answer is not just force. It also has to do with connivance and conditioning and charisma. It's about the ability of these soldiers to convince people to go along with them, which I think more of them did than is remembered. Um, I'm not going to say that they were popular, certainly not universally popular. There were plenty of detractors who they had in Nigeria and in the Nigerian diaspora in this era. Um, but there was no mass revolt against them, which I think is significant. In 30 odd years of military rule, enough people were well served by militarism as an ideology that um, uh, they didn't stage a mass rebellion against it. I think it's hard to see that if you think that a dictatorship works exclusively through violence or force. Violence is one of the tools that dictatorship has in its quiver, but it's certainly not the only one, and it's maybe not the best one. Which again is something that I'm now sort of seeing here in the United States play out every day in the news. Um, Okay, I should stop because I'm never going to respond to all of your points, but I have written all of them down and I'm going to think about them a lot. Um, Shall we open it up to questions from the room? I can't see you all very well, but if you raise your hand, perhaps Eric, who is in the room, can call on you.
Yes. Good morning, Professor. This is the first. Okay, so, morning. Can you hear me, please? Can you hear me? All right.
Morning.
Yeah, fine. Good. Good morning, Professor. My name is Bacon from Nigeria, and morning to Dr. Taiwo too. I want to. There's a question I want to ask. Your book, although there's a what's it called? Like like an excerpt I read. My thinking is that while drafting the book while writing it, the whole process. Did you think of doing a sort of comparative between Nigeria and Sierra Leone? Because I believe Sierra Leone to an extent like has a shared history with Nigeria when it comes to militarism and military governance. So while writing, did you think of probably fusing a bit of Sierra Leone, what happened in Sierra Leone, or probably juxtaposing between Nigeria and Sierra Leone because number one, shared history, shared geography, and also due to Nigeria's peacekeeping role back then. Thank you very much.
Mhm. Thank you. So your question points to a problem of scale in the book. The title does not refer to Nigeria at all, and if you look at the actual physical copy of the book, which somebody is holding there, you can see that on the cover is Jerry Rawlings of Ghana, not Nigerian at all. I really do believe that the dynamics that I describe in this book are portable beyond the Nigerian context, and the places where they would make sense would be Sierra Leone, as you say, also Uganda, Gambia, uh, Ghana. Ghana would be probably the closest analog, and a handful of other places in Anglophone Africa, but also in the wider former British colonial world. I mean, the place that I think arguably has the most similarity to Nigeria with regard to some of these dynamics that I'm describing, especially about the relationship between the military and the judiciary, is Pakistan. So a place that is pretty geographically far, but is really quite similar in terms of its experience in this era. Militarism was a global phenomenon in the 20th century, and just about if you're totting up the number of people who lived under an ideology in this era, I mean, militarism would be maybe the biggest. We're talking about some of the world's most populous countries. Pakistan, Brazil, Nigeria, Indonesia, all of these countries had extended periods of military administration in the late 20th century. And it was a highly portable, highly translatable ideology from one place to another. I don't think those regimes were just communists with guns or capitalists with guns, but there was something distinctive about militarism that all of them shared. Um, this to go specifically more into the dynamics of Sierra Leone, as you described, the judiciary piece there is very similar. There's also something about the youthfulness of Sierra Leone's regimes that is notable. Johnny Paul Koroma, Valentin Strasser, these men were exceptionally young, even by the standards of other military rulers of the era. I think Strasser was 25 years old when he came to power. And there was a generational politics to military rule that you found in Nigeria as well. All of these men spoke of themselves as young, even when, as towards the later era of military rule, they were no longer that young. Abacha was in middle age, Babangida was too, but they still spoke of themselves as if they were, vim and vigorous 20-year-olds. There was something kind of anti-gerontocratic about military rule in that it very often involved young men overthrowing older men. And Sierra Leone is kind of a paradigmatic example of that, even more than Nigeria. But thank you for your question.
Okay. What?
Okay, thank you. My name is Abayomi. Can I ask a question not specifically about the book, but in relation to militarism, military rule? Okay,
Go for it.
okay. So, and I'll be looking at that with respect to military rule in Nigeria, because having been born in the military era to a military father and live in the military base and had some first-hand experience of military regimes and transition to civil rule, for instance, in Nigeria and some other West African country, how far away would you say the current democratic governance that we have are away from militarism? For instance, in Nigeria, at least we've had two former military leaders that have also come to be democratic leaders. So how far away would we say current democratic rules are from military rules? And then why do we think, or why do we see, or why does it seem as if the populists are now drawing comparison between military rule and democratic rules and finding interest in some military officers that have also taken over power in some West African states around Nigeria now? Because with Traore of Burkina Faso, you'd always see comparisons drawn. And then so we're saying, are the populists, I think you mentioned something, are the populists really interested in the force, the rule, the mode, or why the interest or the comparison? And how far away is democracy today in, for instance, Nigeria from militarism?
That's a very good question, and I don't know that I have a good answer for it. Historians are notoriously bad at talking about the present, much less predicting the future. I would say, though, that the forces that are leading to military takeovers in other parts of West and Central Africa today, especially in countries like Niger and Burkina, are, I think, very similar to the forces that led people to accept military rule in Nigeria in the past. Which is to say, if it seems that things are disorderly, if it seems that the thread is about to come off the spool, as it did in Burkina and Niger in recent years, well, then the promise of the military is very potent. Now, militaries there and pretty much everywhere else are, I think it's fair to say, not actually very good at enforcing order in the day-to-day. They're very good at enforcing order for their own members, but they are not very good at doing that for civilian society. But at least in the short term, that doesn't really matter because the promise of order is meaningful enough that people will accept military rule at least for a while. And that's what I see as going on in those countries, Burkina, Niger, Mali, a few other places on the map, but those are the most important ones. As for the Nigeria part of your question, I don't know. My sense is that it is a meaningful difference that Obasanjo and Buhari came back to power as civilians. I think that it is not the same that they when they came back to power out of uniform. Um, but that said, it is very clear that this long era of Nigerian history has left marks on Nigerian society in important ways. And a series of regimes that exists for over a generation doesn't just vanish overnight when it ends. The traces of the military era are visible in Nigeria everywhere. You know, from NYSC members in the street to the architecture. You know, I mean, it's a very visible, very present legacy. How much that translates into politics, I genuinely don't know, you know, and uh, uh, I always try to keep my eye trained on the past, but that means that sometimes I don't have a clear sense of what's going on in the present, if I'm being completely honest. But thank you for that question.
Good. We have two more questions in the room.
Great.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Sam. My name is David Olusanjo. I'm a grad student in political science at FIU, and I'm passionate about this topic because it centers so much on my research interest. So I do have a couple of questions that I would like to ask because given that these topics dovetail and center on political science, just like nexus between political science and also history. So my first question centers around, military and development because you use a lot of concept borders on military legality and development. And so my first question was, just about 4 months ago, one of the Nigerian former military leaders wrote a book that generated a lot of debate and a furor within the country. Former Governor General of, Nigeria, um, IPB, Ibrahim Babangida, he wrote a book titled A Journey in Service by Ibrahim Babangida, which generated a lot of debate and argument around the country. So, it told a lot, like, it claimed that military brought about privatization, about the IMF, about the SAP, about People's Bank and Community Bank, and some of the development that he brought during the military rule. So, I'm not trying to, there's this debate within the comparative politics about how military, tends to bring more development than the civilian role. So, I'm not trying to, do you, believe that if we have more military rule and power, just like we have in Burkina Faso, where most people pounce the idea that Ibrahim Traoré is bringing more development to Burkina Faso. Do you support having a military rule because they tend to have because they have a disregard for the legality for legal constraint. So do you support the idea of having military rule because they tend to bring more development? And aside from that, and also I'm equally interested in how ethnicity, because I call one of the readers spoke about or touch on ethnicity. I'm just curious to know about how ethnicity plays a role. Do you find any ethnical role in how ethnicity shape militarism in Africa? And the second part of my question is around because I call Dr. Herrick mentioned about Uganda. Maybe you made a comparison about Uganda and how one of the I didn't read the book, but I just took a bird eye view of the book, just a cursory look at the book, but I didn't read the whole book. And also in talking chapter 6 on how I know court martial and how military court martial some people or thereabouts. So you mentioned that Anini during IBB's Babangida during IBB's time, how he made a public spoof of Anini and all of those issues. So given also summarize my question, given the recent event in Uganda, because I want to make a reference to Uganda, of course, given the development in Uganda, Yoweri Museveni just signed a law about a couple of weeks ago on, because he clamped down on the opposition using his strengths and he tried to use the courts because he said he's going to court martial opposition. They don't have to try in civilian courts. They have to trial. Civilian has to be trial in military courts just to clamp down opposition. So do you think current civilian rule, giving the example of Yoweri Museveni and using the courts to, because your book touched on legalism and also militarism. So do you think if legality is serving as a constraint on development because it tried to use military, use the courts sideline them and like say no, you have to bring them to like court martial and civilian rule. So just I mean, is the legality serving as a constraint for developments around the world, not just in Nigeria? I mean, how legality? Because at times I feel if you have military rule, they bring more development, and with disregard for legality, they tend to bring more development. So those are just my comments and like question. Yeah, thank you so much. And that is a wonderful book because I just read a few chapters. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you for those. I would start by saying that I actually don't think that military governments are any better at development than civilian ones. And that example seems to be borne out by Nigerian history. This was not a time of great prosperity for Nigeria. I mean, there were variations within it, and it tended to correspond to the price of oil on the international market, all the things that we know are what shape prosperity, especially in Nigeria. But one of those factors was not whether the military was in charge or not. So if the goal of a state is to develop in a very tangible economic sense, then military rule doesn't seem to be particularly helpful towards that. The military touted the fact that it was good at building infrastructure projects, for example. So if there was a bridge to be built, that bridge had to be built by day X, and if it wasn't, then heads would roll, literally. But that rhetoric was not matched by its actual efficiency. And when it came right down to it, military governments were not really any more efficient at getting things done than civilian ones. As for the role of the courts and all of that, I mean, you're probably right that legalism and excessive legalism especially has a tendency to slow down economic growth and development. But military governments were not less legalistic than civilian ones. If anything, as the book shows, they were in some ways more. So if we're looking for efficiency in terms of a clean, well-functioning court system, well, you'd have to look elsewhere than a military regime. As to your second question about ethnicity, I mean, this is important, and this goes back to something that a colleague said that I didn't really address in my remarks. I admit that I may have overplayed my hand somewhat about ethnicity. I don't mean to suggest that it explains nothing about Nigerian history. And somebody like Udoma, who both you and Akali gesture to, his career is not cannot be understood without understanding the important role of ethnicity in federal politics. He was a minority. He was from one of the groups that wasn't, protected by anybody at the federal level. And he really did believe that that was one of the reasons, if not the main reason, why he had been passed over. And he ended up writing a 600-page book about it. So if you want the full case that he made, he wrote it down quite voluminously. Um, I stand by my contention that it doesn't explain everything, but I don't mean to explain that ethnicity explains nothing. It is an important factor. Was there another question in the room?
Yes,
I couldn't
one
quite
last question.
see.
Okay.
Okay.
Can you hear me? So,
Yes.
congratulations, Samuel, on your new book. When I saw it in the LSA Facebook, I wanted actually to listen to you because by the way, I'm Ngozi Kaubiani. I work on Biafra War Memories. So I've seen your book earlier, and I decided to come and listen to you. But as a historian, I'm just trying to also to understand maybe at what point did you stop the periodization of this military study? Because I'm just thinking about, we've also had people who turned from military to civilian presidents in Nigeria. And then when you link it to legal system, you find out that in most cases, they never also did not obey court orders or court rules. So I want to see if there is any linkage to that. And another thing is that I would love to review the book and then publish it in in a good journal anyway. So I don't know how I'll have the access, or do I need to contact maybe Africa or African Affairs to see if I can get the book and review it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for your questions. I'll start by saying I would love for you to review the book. You can write to the press and get a copy sent to you. It's also, I should note, available open access online. So if you want a soft digital copy, You just have to Google the title of the book and you'll find it online. It's open for everybody.
Okay.
Uh, if you want more advice, send me an email and I can send you some places where that might be interested in a review. To your question about periodization, which is a very good one, I decided to stop the book in 1999 with the formal end of military rule. When Abacha dies, suddenly brief jockeying of power, and as we all know, eventually an election is held. I'm not sure that that was the right choice. And as you say, there were some enduring legacies of this period into the 2000s, including and especially the fact that the first civilian president was a former general himself, a retired general. I think that there were also continuities in terms of how the courts worked. Courts are slow to change, even in the best of times. They are supposed to be the branch of government that is most resistant to change. Um, and that was true in Nigeria as anywhere else. I mean, many of the judges who are on the bench today, because this is a profession that tends to privilege sagacity and age, people who got their start during the military regime, during the military years. So, you're absolutely right that the periodization of this book could have been different. And one way of thinking about military rule would be to say that it never fully, completely came to an end. I think we're just about at time, so we should probably wrap up here. But I just want to say thank you so much to all of you for responding to this book, and to those of you in the room for being here. It means a lot, and I'm grateful.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sam. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Okay, have a good day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.